Okay, let's talk about community ecology. When we talk about communities, we mean many interacting species living in a particular area. And these kind of interactions are what we would call interspecific interactions, interactions between species, as opposed to intraspecific, which would be within members of the same species. As you can see, there are many examples of the types of interactions that can occur between different species: competition, predation, herbivory, parasitism, disease, mutualism, commensalism. The plus and minus shows whether it's detrimental to both, or beneficial to one and detrimental to the other, or beneficial to both, and this simply means beneficial to one and no effect on the other. We'll talk about examples of those in a minute. Now, with competition, we saw that they're negative, they're detrimental to both of them, and that's not that they're necessarily eating each other, but that they are competing for a shared resource. And so that competition between them has a negative effect on both of them. And this can lead to what's called competitive exclusion, and that is one species can outcompete the other. This was formulated by a Russian scientist named Gauss, who came up with the competitive exclusion principle, and his idea was that no two species occupying the same ecological niche can coexist because one will outcompete the other. Now, the ecological niche is basically the totality of the living and non-living components or parts of an organism's existence, where it lives, what it does, what it eats, what eats it, all that stuff. I think the term I mentioned in class the other day was the multidimensional hyperspace, just all those things that impact and influence a species. So a species can have what's called the fundamental niche, which are the dimensions of that hyperspace where they can live in theory, but they often have a reduced realized niche that's smaller because of competition from other species. They don't quite occupy all the niche space they could potentially occupy. A good example is the well-known study from out in the Pacific Northwest, these barnacles that live on the rocks in the tidal zone. And there's two species, this bluish one and this brownish one. And so a guy named Payne went out there and did some studies where he would remove one or the other. And what he found was that if you removed the blue one, the brown one would expand lower into the tidal zone. We don't have a picture for it, but if you remove the brown one, the blue one did not really expand its niche further up. So what's going on there? Basically, the blue one lower down in the tidal zone basically outcompetes the other one, and when it's gone, the other one can expand. So basically, the brown one's fundamental niche is larger than its realized niche. Now the other one, though, doesn't expand, so its realized and fundamental niche appear to be about the same. Its main constraint is water. It has to be lower down in the tidal zone because it can't handle the longer periods of drying out that this other one can handle. This other one appears to handle all kinds of wet, dry conditions. Doesn't matter so much. Now, why do we find so many species in spite of competition? Well, it's thought to be due to what's called resource partitioning, and that is the species sort of specialize their niche. They divide up the resources of the environment to avoid competition, and so you can go into tropical areas and find all these small lizards living in the forests, and some live up in the trees, some live on the ground, some live in lower trees, some tend to live more in human habitations. They've adapted to those, and so you get this great variety, but they're all living in slightly different parts of the environment. Again, it's having a more specialized niche, this resource partitioning. This can lead to what's called character displacement, where certain traits tend to diverge as these species specialize. A good example is some of the finches from the Galapagos. These folks named the Porters have studied these extensively. There's these two different species. And so these are all smallish birds, these Darwin's finches, but they have differences in primarily the things they eat. And so there are some with very small, narrow beaks that eat insects, but then there's some others that are seed eaters. And amongst the seed eaters, they have variation in beak size depending on what kinds of seeds they eat. If they eat really hard seeds, big seeds, they have to have a big beak in order to crack them open. We can see when they live on separate islands, their beak sizes are very similar to these two species. That is, when they're allopatric to each other, they're not living in the same area. Now, when they're sympatric to each other on the same island, you start to get divergence, such that now there's selection for this guy having a somewhat bigger beak and this guy having a somewhat smaller beak. And so they begin to specialize on eating smaller seeds or larger seeds when they're together, so they avoid that competition. Again, this would not necessarily be a conscious decision they're making, but it would be a pathway that evolution would take them into. If not, then one of them would presumably outcompete the other and the other would go extinct. Predation. Now, predation is when one organism is eating another, and those predators often have adaptations that allow them to catch them. They're perhaps fleet of foot, or they can hide well and pounce on their prey. They have claws and things like that to subdue them with. Now, of course, prey are not just defenseless against this. They can have behaviors. They can be fast. They can be good at hiding. They can have alarm calls, like we saw with those monkeys when the python came along. So they can have ways of dealing with their predators. Camouflage being a good example. This frog is against this rock, and if it's not moving, you might just stroll by and not even ever know it's there. Again, chemical defenses. Now, on the other side of camouflage is what's called aposematic coloration, and this is when an animal is brightly colored because it's advertising that it is poisonous and you do not want to eat it. Monarch butterflies are an example of this. They stand out. Now, when you have this kind of system, there can be other species that will start to mimic the ones that are poisonous, because they can sort of tag along and get the benefit without necessarily being poisonous themselves. And this is what's called Batesian mimicry, where one that is not poisonous basically mimics one that is. And here's this larva, this caterpillar of a moth, that when it moves its body in a particular way, it kind of looks like the head of a snake, and it can scare off birds and others that are trying to eat it that way. Now, there is also Mullerian mimicry, where two species that are both equally dangerous or not dangerous, whatever, they tend to mimic each other, and so both these guys can be rather dangerous to you. You don't want to get too close to them because they can sting and whatnot, so they tend to look alike, and so you just have this single image in your mind of something that you want to avoid. Herbivory, so now herbivores and the plants they eat or the algae they eat. Now, of course, as it says here, the plants are not just bystanders to this. They have evolved chemical defenses, these secondary compounds they produce that can reduce herbivory. And if in a grove of trees there's lots of caterpillars that have come in or that are there from the butterflies, and they start munching on them, literally the chemical signal of that damaged tissue can cause the trees to start producing more of these secondary compounds and make them less palatable to the caterpillars, for example. Parasitism, so you have a parasite and a host, something it's living on, so a tick, a tapeworm, a leech. These can range from things that are relatively benign and don't really hurt you much to things that can hurt you and sometimes can carry diseases. And so diseases is, again, a permutation of parasitism, so it's something that lives inside of you and is known as being a pathogen, causes a disease. Bacteria, viruses, protists, again, can range from relatively benign things like just the common cold up to things that can be quite deadly. Now, a symbiosis is anytime you have a close relationship between two species, and any of these interactions can come under what we call a symbiosis. Now, a mutualistic symbiosis in particular is one where both species benefit, and I described this in class. The bullhorn acacia, this tropical tree, and these ants that live on them, and the tree provides a place to live, and these little structures that these nutritive things that the ants eat, and in turn the ant protects the tree, keeps herbivores away, and also mows down the surrounding vegetation. And so This guy Dan Jansen from UPenn did some studies, well-known studies, where he fumigated particular trees to remove the ants, and it wasn't too many years before the acacias without the ants were not doing so well, because things would come along and eat them, and other plants were growing up around them, and so they were not good competitors without the ants around. So a good example of what we would call a co-evolved relationship. These two species have co-evolved together to form this tight symbiosis, this mutualism. Commensalism is a little unusual. It's where you have one species that benefits and another that, as far as we can tell, is not affected one way or the other. And so these birds that follow the herds of herbivores around these water buffaloes are eating the insects that are stirred up as the buffaloes walk through the fields, and so they benefit, but as far as we can tell, the water buffalo do not benefit from the presence of the birds. Now, if the bird were eating some kind of parasite off the buffalo, that would obviously be a mutualism. Okay, so again, these interactions co-evolve, the two species evolving in response to each other, whether it's predator and prey co-evolving or host and pathogen co-evolving. All right, now some other types of things we can see in communities. You can have species that have an inordinate impact on the system. They can be either dominant and keystone species. And so when we talk about the whole community, we can speak of the diversity or the species richness of that community. So species richness is really just the total number of species that you have there. And relative abundance, or what's sometimes called species diversity, is takes into account how many of each type you have. So let's look at these two communities. So community 1 and community 2 have, these tree communities have the same number of species. They have 4 species. But now if you look at them though, the composition is not the same. So the bottom one, as you can see, is dominated by species A, what looks perhaps like an oak tree, and not so much here. This one, it's equally distributed amongst the 4 species. So we would say these two species are equally species rich, but the bottom one is less diverse because it's dominated by one species and doesn't have very many to the other. And it's not in our slideshow, but there are mathematical ways of determining this, and there's several different what are called diversity indices. The most famous is what's called the Shannon Diversity Index, and you can sample a community and calculate how diverse it is based on the distribution of the different species. Okay, within communities we have what's called a trophic structure, or basically food chains. And so you, of course, at the bottom of the food chain you have your producers. These are the autotrophs, the things that are producing food. And above that you have all the consumers. The first level are the herbivores. Then you get up into carnivores and omnivores and other carnivores further up the food chain. This is dynamics within a community, but we'll see how these also play a role in ecosystem ecology. We talk about that some more, because in these food chains we're concerned with the movement of matter. That is, you're eating something to get the nutrients from them, but also energy. You're getting energy from them. And if there's one thing that ecosystem ecologists are often concerned with, it's the movement of energy through natural systems. Now, these are really not, a chain is not a completely correct way, because these are often webs. That is, things don't eat just one thing, and they're usually not eaten by just one thing. So there's a lot of interconnections between all the species in this system. Although we can always take a look at just individual parts and see what happens to them, and how, say, predation by the sea nettle on the juvenile fish can impact the adult fish. It may not eat many of the adult fish, or the adult fish may be big enough to avoid them, but the juvenile fish can be impacted. So different stages of the life stage of an organism may or may not be prey for something else that's in the system. Okay, I'm out of time here, and we'll finish it with another video. Thanks.